Well, the Christian at church should have heard yesterday at least something in the direction of larger reforms about using the law of God as an evangelistic tool. This is an idea that's not accepted among Christian people. They think that evangelism is simply personal testimony about what God has done for you personally. And they largely, because they're antinomian, which means they're anti-law, they reject the idea that the gospel of grace, right, the gospel of redemption, forgiveness by God of man and his sins, that gospel does not have a cultural implication or a purpose beyond the individual's going to heaven, right? They're preoccupied with heaven and the next life, and they ignore, by and large, the salting effects of the gospel in its teachings about grace and its teachings about law and culture as having an effect in general and in society. But culture is simply religion writ large, right? Idolatry, you could say, idolatry is fears writ into culture. Idolatry is one's fears written into culture. That's what idolatry is, as the Christian would define it based on his written revelation. And we are motivated by fear today. Americans and conservatives, evangelicals are a very fearful people. That's why the so-called right, the conservatives, adopt one by one, over and over again, systems of thought and institutions of control that the progressives want. And here, in the past 10 or 15 years, that is the restrictions on immigration. That is a left-wing proposition, a left-wing, union-oriented, socialist-oriented, occultic-based perspective that finally went out in the 1920s, up until which time the United States was an open borders country. Those forces got the first immigration control passed, and recent there was some freedom in the 1980s, but now again we have the conservatives, the so-called defenders of the free market, boosting external state controls on innocent non-criminal people who have done nothing criminal and for which there is no criminal record anywhere. Okay, that's what so-called conservatives want. And so I've had enough of conservatives. I'm fed up with conservatives. I'm particularly fed up with Republicans who back every state totalitarian scheme, especially if people on the left are against it. Now, I've given it as an example a very good book I'm reading right now, which is called The End of Policing. It's written by a liberal. And here he's giving many of the arguments against state control of human society through coercion and force and the gun, right? That's what police are a military occupation of a city by the mayor's office. Mayor Andy Burke is occupying Chattanooga with a 500-strong standing army called the Chattanooga Police Department, which does have constitutionally authority to enforce ordinances and has authority statutorily to enforce some statutes. That would be the part of the traffic code, and not much else. I mean, the fact that we have the CPD and police departments around Chattanooga enforcing statute broadly is a serious problem. It is a legal problem about which I'm thinking. Even today, I'm thinking about this problem. It's a legal problem that's already been ruled on by the High Court. The High Court has already ruled on it, and yet it's still a mystery, and no one seems to understand what that ruling was, which is already about maybe 15 years old or so. And the chapter I'm reading is called "Criminalizing Homelessness," and so I'm just concerned about this war on homelessness in Chattanooga. How bad is the criminalization of homelessness in Chattanooga? Well, it's pretty bad. But there are people who are accountable to you, my listener. That would be, I'm thinking here of Sheriff Jim Hammond, the sheriff of Hamilton County. He's accountable to the voters, and so promises to be his rival, Victor Miller, a Democrat, who is the only other announced candidate for sheriff of Hamilton County. The most powerful man in the county is the sheriff, and Miller is the detective. And he comes from the police world. Okay, I think it's better to have a sheriff who's not a military professional and not a police professional, because it is a political office primarily. It is a political office primarily. It is not a law enforcement office primarily. Its roots are in peace maintenance and the pursuit of real crime, not what we have today, which is law enforcement. That being the sole job of police officers. Police officers would readily tell you, "Well, I'm involved in law enforcement. That's what they do." Peacekeeping is clearly a second point, and it's also policing, especially when violence ensues and abuse, perjurious acts, and other things like that. Abusive acts. These are all political in nature. They are political acts that force public bodies and the people to act and react in given ways. They are. It is a political activity. Policing. It is a political activity, not just a legal activity. And because we have so much policing in Chattanooga, we have a homelessness problem that's exacerbated by it. We have a jail crisis, overcrowding problem exacerbated by policing per se, whether it's done by sheriff's deputies or police departments. And we have seemingly intractable problems. But my analysis of the policing problem this morning, the homelessness problem, touching on the exacerbation of homelessness by external force, is that it's worse elsewhere in places such as Seattle than here, but that it is a grave problem here as well. This is David Tulis, and we are arguing for local economy and the free markets. I like sans serif type. You could pick out Geneva, you could pick out Helvetica. Both are very similar fonts, and I like those forms of type because they're neutral. They're neutral. They don't make any kind of argument. In fact, the Swiss are the great neutrals. They're great peacemakers of the world, the Swiss people, with whom I have a connection, by the way. I argue that you should love your neighbor and buy local. And the sans serif type means that the letters don't have the little razor blades on them, okay? Serifs are the little shoes that you see on the ends of letters, like the letter A, for the word, let's say artery, the capital A. You have little feet on the bottom of the two sticks that at the top merge at the point, right? The little pyramid, and at the feet are on the blue line on your piece of paper. Well, the serifs are blades, especially when they are written by government, right? When the government, the county government passes, or the city passes an ordinance, or the state passes a statute, the words always have compulsion, force, and coercion in them. We're going to make something happen, right? And we're going to threaten you. If you don't do what we say, we're going to threaten you with jail, fines, accusations, civil accusations, criminal proceedings, and the like. I'm for the neutral sans serif font because it's voluntary, right? It's peacemaking, it's voluntary, and I think we can get along together. I think we can get along together. Even Chattanooga United for Action Verbs would agree with that. In fact, that's one of that doctrinaire liberal group's goals is a bit more peace in the city. Though they have an unfathomable confidence in government programs, nonetheless, right? Being Democrats, they think that we have to have more subsidized housing and things like that. Well, I think that we're better off if we have the ideas clear in mind that near is better than far, small than big, and simple than complex. And then in the footnotes at 5-point type, still sans serif, Helvetica, or Geneva font. Personal is better than corporate, and physical is better than abstract. I think you should like us. We're live on Facebook at Nooga Radio, and also live on YouTube. Sorry, YouTube. And I argue that you should love your neighbor and buy local. That's just touching on your commerce, but there is a lot for it. Now, the church should be teaching that the role of the civil magistrate is passive. It's not active, but passive. And because we disagree with Christianity, Christianity is held in disrepute by people. Most people in the church hold Christianity in very low regard when it comes to government. They think somehow that there's a thing called natural law, and somehow what we have in the way of government and civil magistrate and policing and taxation and the state and bureaucracy, that this is all it's normative because it is, right? That's really the argument that power wins, right? If you have power and you can change things outwardly, then that becomes the new norm. So power is your source of law. That's essentially that's writ big what a lot of church-going people believe. And so they have an executive state. They believe in the executive state. The biblical model is the state is passive. It's largely just the court. And as the very fine story in the newspaper, this this Sunday about Marion County and Etna Mountain. And there's a great quote in there from one of the attorneys, and he says the court is open. Well, that's exactly right. The court is open, and if there's a dispute, we just have to have a hearing on the facts and the law. We don't have to preemptively regulate, as we are seeing more and more of today. Even in Chattanooga, the policing experiment, which is, I think, an extra constitutional legal experiment that is being allowed by the state, because the state, of course, profits from the policing activity, even though it's outside the statute. Even there, we see something like of what is happening in Hartford, Connecticut. We have real-time intelligence operation, and there in Hartford, according to, let's see, Activist Post, there is a current matrix of 700 cameras. There's $2.5 million going to be spent in 2018 to boost the number well past that and expand state police, the state and police power and surveillance, even with cameras outside of homes. And it wants to thwart violence in documented high crime areas. But the new program, the story says, goes far beyond identification and quick response. In fact, it is admittedly going to be used for pre-crime detection, as well as social engineering to better control what they are euphemistically calling quality of life issues. So you analyze and predict, right? Analyze data, masses of data by computer algorithms, and then project power. If there's something that's not normal, well, then send the officer by, right? You have these nosy officers on wellness checks. Just by the way, before I forget, Michael Flynn is a smart man. You, my listener, can be even smarter than him. If you just remember one thing, he was unwise enough, he was fearful enough to begin long discussions under penalties of perjury with investigators. You know, you shouldn't do that. You should simply not do that. When someone wants to talk to you under penalty of perjury and it's a state actor, the best thing to do is say, well, if you've got something against me, just indict me. That it sounds terrifying to say, but I think that's the best thing. You should give yourself a Miranda warning that anything you say will be used against you in court, and that you have a right to an attorney present during any questioning, and you can stop any interview at any time if you feel that you are incriminating yourself in a criminal matter. That's what Michael Flynn did. And if you look at the two-page information, which is in lieu of indictment against him, it says that on or about January 24, defendant Michael T. Flynn, all capital letters, by the way, did willfully and knowingly make materially false, fictitious, and fraudulent statements and representations in a matter within the jurisdiction of the executive branch of the government of the United States, to wit, the defendant falsely stated and represented to agents several points. There are two points. And so what he didn't do was, he wasn't prudent. And he should say, I make no statement. If you have if I've done anything wrong, indict me. And so his penalty, his sin, his crime came in giving the statements, okay, which in a very complex matter, liable for interpretation, liable to be misread. If the FBI was involved, no video recordings or audio recordings were made. None. 800-8949, 800-8949. And so he did something foolish that you, my listener, I hope will not do, and that is talk. The more you talk, the more you're going to be incriminated, the more cause there is going to be against you. Keep your trap shut. Chattanooga Police Department has been remiss now for some time. I'm not sure how long it's been going on as policy, but the policy is every person under arrest should be Mirandized. But the definition of arrest, of course, is subjective, right? Not if you read Tennessee jurisprudence, it's not, but in the department, it is subjective. And you can actually be taken to the magistrate and not have been read your Miranda rights. We know this is a grievous oversight, and Mayor Andy Burke should, since he is in charge, Mayor Andy Burke should dictate that officers obey the Miranda policy, which is simply an outlining of what the Constitution allows in the way of protections of defendants and suspects and arrestees and detainees, and that the policy of the department on page 6 of the 13-page arrest procedures manual be adhered to. That is what Andy Burke, our mayor, should be doing. Now we're running out of time. To the homeless question, Sheriff Hammond is burdened by an inflow of arrestees by cops and his own deputies. And he says that in his 2016 policy report published by the department, he tells about the crisis intervention training classes that his deputies are taking. And he says also, accordingly, our jails and prisons have become the mental health institutions in our country. The majority of these people are homeless as well. So the continuing cycle between jails, emergency rooms, hospitals, and other temporary treatment centers continues to cost our taxpayers millions of dollars a year to maintain a broken system. Yes, the system is broken, but we have begun earnestly addressing the situation. This is good. We have begun earnestly addressing the situation. Again, the intersection among homeless people, mentally ill people, and state law enforcement by deputies and by police department officers. He wants to separate out peacekeeping and law enforcement from the social problems that which group is best qualified to handle. All right, the social problems are homelessness and mental illness, which makes many people homeless. It makes many people subject to deliriums and addictions, and clear confusions of mind. People whose center of their beings is not sitting on the seat of reason, and so they are half on and half off the seat of reason, and are unable to. They've made themselves incapable of thinking ahead, of having any kind of long-term plan. Even of obeying God's commandments, as they might suggest, to provide for yourself, or be worse than an infidel. Oneself and one's dependence. That's what God requires, and God enables every man to do that, except some who have rejected this government are in a problem. The problem of homelessness in Chattanooga is in the most recent survey by about 50 volunteers is nearly 2 years old, and that is January of 16. This group counted 527 homeless people in an 11 county area, down from 634 people in 2015. And of those, 96 were under the age of 18. Dylan Burrows of Relevant Hope, the ministry, says that about 60 locations across the city serve as homeless encampments. Now, I was remembering this morning that police had destroyed one encampment. I couldn't find that story. The most recent picture of conflict between the law and the homeless was not really. It was there've been intervening events, and that was the demolition of a homeless encampment that had been extant for about a decade under Broad Street. Was demolished by unknown parties last year, and but the one where police did it, I just didn't find it this morning. So, but I'd say that that because God has blessed Chattanooga and Hamilton County in a way that He has not places such as Seattle, there is more lenity and more grace. Now, an important author in a book I'm reading is called The End of Policing. His name is Alex Vitale. He's a professor of sociology at CUNY, City University of New York. He has a chapter 5. I just finished, criminalizing homelessness. That's kind of why I wanted to bring this up. But what has happened is that the social problems that cause homelessness are never addressed, and really cannot be addressed by the law, right? That's why Sheriff Hammond is so frustrated, because people want homeless people to not be there, right? And many of them commit infractions, public urination. They are ugly. They're sleeping in public, and various cities have programs to eliminate them. For example, Seattle, he says, has a civil violation approach and has gone to an extreme to remove homeless people from particular places such as parks or rows of cheap hotels, or even entire neighborhoods. And these bans can last a day or longer. And Catherine Beckett and Steve Herbert, in a paper, argued that this is a return to the discredited medieval practice of banishment as a strategy for managing the poor and the unwanted. And police have almost total discretion in these civil matters. There's no formal hearing. The burden of proof is very low, and police use these orders to get rid of people and push people out, to take their blankets from them, to demolish their tents or their houses of cardboard. And we don't have, it's not as bad here as elsewhere. So I think if you're a Christian, you can say, well, praise God for that. However, there is still a problem, and that is the whole dynamic of intake. That is to say, arresting people who don't need to be arrested, period. And that could be as much as 40% of the population in the jail. And so the problem, I think, we can solve not necessarily by trying to solve the underlying problem of homelessness and mental illness, which is connected with it, but we can reduce intake, and have officers use their discretion more and not be so rigid. David Tulis, Nooga Radio.
Traffic, news, and information. Nooga Radio. Digital FM 95.